The video that you're about to watch is, fair warning, rather long. It's a lot longer than most of the things that you're going to find in this space. It was a request from a beekeeping supplier that I work with for the bees that I've been managing over the past several years. The honey came from his family honey operation, and it is a walkthrough of the process for a standard strength and sack strength traditional mead. I hope you find it to be useful, and good luck. It's morning on day 3, and it's time to add our third nutrient addition. As you saw in the video earlier, there are some bubbles rising now in the carboys. So it's an indication that the yeast are doing what they're supposed to do, even though we don't see a whole lot of bubbling going on in the airlocks. There's some, but it's not rapid or anything. And because of the bubbles, it's probably a good idea to approach this next step with a certain amount of caution. So we're going to remove the airlock and give it a gentle stir to make sure that we don't get an explosion of CO2 coming out of solution before we add anything else to it. So put that in my sanitizer. I've got my sanitized rod here, and let's see, very gently. At this stage of the game, we also don't want to introduce too much oxygen. A little bit is okay, but we want to start minimizing that exposure. So we're not getting huge amounts, so I can get a little bit more aggressive, and then let's take a little pause. All right, looking pretty good here. Alright, now this is the last nutrient addition for the time being. We will do one more on day 7. So between now and day 7, we're really not going to do anything. We're just going to let it ferment. Keep an eye on it just to make sure if it's getting too aggressive or whatever, we can take steps. But I'm not expecting that to be a problem, partly because of the temperature here. As you saw previously, the temp strip on the carboy is showing that we have a glass temperature of about 62 to 64 degrees, which matches my basement temperature pretty well. And for this particular yeast strain, and most of the yeast strains that I typically use with traditionals, I like to ferment them at the pretty much the bottom end of the range, not to the absolute bottom range of the tolerance listed for the yeast, but somewhere near the bottom. It tends to produce a little cleaner flavor without the yeast introducing too many things to the honey character that I'm really after in a traditional. And we're going to follow the same process with the sack strength mead. And so far so good. Okay, I think we're all set. There's really no point in taking a gravity reading at this stage of the game because there is not a whole lot of alcohol being produced yet. We just got out of what's called the lag phase, which is about the first 24 hours or so. And then during the 24 to 72 hour range, it's the reproductive phase. So the yeast is busy multiplying, and when they reach a certain level, they kind of stop doing that and start producing alcohol in the third phase. So we're just about at that stage now, and going forward we'll start to see more alcohol. At that point it's time to take a gravity reading and check progress. But for now, we're good. So we'll close it up and we'll come back in several days on day 7 for the last nutrient. As you can see, this mead has cleared quite nicely. There's a yeast cake on the bottom, and so we're going to go through the process today of racking out of this container into another container to remove the mead from what we call the lees, which is the yeast cake that's on the bottom of the vessel. Following that process, we will do some bottling so you can see the finished product. Okay, step 1 was to sanitize our new container, which has been done. And then I'm going to add a little bit of a water and metabisulfite mixture, which I previously dosed, and we aren't going to get into that chemistry at this point, but the whole reason for adding some metabisulfite here is to scavenge oxygen, which is always going to be introduced when we move our mead from one vessel to another. No matter how gentle we are, how careful we are, it's going to happen. I've got some sanitizer in this bucket. I've got this wonderful little tool called a mini auto siphon, and this is an invaluable tool for dealing with small batches like this. We would like to be as careful as possible to avoid disturbing the yeast on the bottom. We'll let gravity do the work for us here. So very, very carefully now. Get this down to the bottom. Inevitably, we're going to pick up a very small amount of yeast here. That's okay. And we'll let that fill. Once it's filled, we'll come back and we'll do some bottling again using this device. This has a high temp silicone hose on it, which is very flexible and easy to pinch off. And quite honestly, for bottling still mead, which is what this is, non-carbonated, this is one of the easiest ways that you could possibly bottle. And it's also very, very inexpensive. You don't need a whole bunch of fancy equipment. So we'll let this finish and then we'll come back and do some bottling. As you can see, I managed to avoid getting yeast in here. It looks very nice and clear. And before we start our bottling, of course, we have to sample the mead. This mead is clearly orange blossom honey. It finished off dry, which is about exactly where I would have expected this particular batch of mead to finish. So for somebody who's a wine drinker, this would be very pleasant. For many mead makers, this would probably be a little too dry. It's not tart or sour or anything like that. It's just more on the dry side, and most mead makers tend to make their mead a little sweeter. I like mine a little drier, so for me, this is perfect. Well, let's get started with the bottling process. If you're doing this on a budget, flip top bottles are a nice way to go if you can get your hands on them. They don't require special bottling equipment, you don't need a capper, and they're just easy to manage, and of course they're reusable if you clean them properly. But on a long-term basis, I prefer to not use the flip tops because I don't think they seal quite as well as a cap does. So I have my bottles pre-sanitized, and to be honest, the trickiest part about getting this going is getting the auto siphon started in one of the bottles, because these things have a tendency to fall over when you're getting the siphon started. So let's see if we can manage to do this here. Woohoo! Very gently, there we go. Okay, so we'll just let this run. And when we get up close to the top, pinch it off, leave about an inch to an inch and a half of head space. It doesn't matter. If you can fill them all the way up to. Don't want to leave too much open space because that just promotes oxidation. The metabisulfite will bind, and that'll keep you from getting oxidation under normal circumstances, but eventually that metabisulfite is going to lose its effectiveness. So we want to minimize that risk if at all possible. We'll get all the rest of these filled and capped, and that should conclude this video on a how-to with traditional honeys. Thanks for watching. I hope you found it useful.